Good evening, this is Quintus Curtius. Welcome back to the podcast. And this podcast is going to be the first of several podcasts, maybe two, maybe three, on my new book, a translation of Cicero's On Moral Ends. And I wanted to do this podcast, you could almost call it a lecture series, just to explain the work, discuss some of the major highlights, and maybe help introduce people to the work, because it's a very, very rich and complicated work, and it really would benefit from some discussion and some explanation. So I wanted to do that because it may not be generally known to most people. So I think we can all really benefit from that. So that's what I'm going to do. There may be two, maybe three podcasts, depending on how far we get. The work itself is currently available on Amazon, and there's links to it on my website. I'll post a link to it in this podcast as well. And it's available right now in both paperback and also in Kindle, and you can find that on Amazon. And I'll be referring to the book during this podcast, and you can follow along if you already have the book. If not, you can maybe look into getting that. The way the system works out on Amazon is that if you buy the paperback, if you buy the paperback version of the work, the Kindle version then is like $2.99. So there is a deal there involved. But whatever works. Some people like Kindle, some people like paperback. Whatever works, it doesn't really matter. I'm also working on a audiobook version, and my reader is going to be available towards the end of the month here, so he'll start working on that. That probably will be ready in another, three weeks or so. So we're getting all the bases covered, all the avenues covered here. So the format of this, we're going to go through sort of a brief introduction to the work, give an overview of it, and then go into the books and talk about the major highlights. So let me go ahead and turn to and do that. All right. Well, let's start out with the work itself. What are the basics of this work? The Latin title of this work is De Finibus Bonorum et Malorum, which in English means on the ends of goods and evils. And you might say, okay, what the hell does that mean? Well, to understand and to explain what the title means, we have to understand that there was one of the major problems of Greek philosophy that existed at Cicero's time was what should be the ultimate goal that man should direct his life towards? What was our ultimate aim? What is our ultimate good? What is the highest of all goods? You see, philosophers up until that time had talked about, the man has a variety of physical and mental goods. But there was an idea that there must be some overriding ultimate good, some summum bonum, that all the other goods somehow related back to, or their energies were directed towards. And this is really the idea of On Moral Ends, that there must be some ultimate good, some ultimate best goal or directive or end state that we should really focus our life's activities on. And that's really what the book is about. And Cicero proposes to analyze this question from the perspective of the three major philosophical schools of his day: Epicureanism, Stoicism, and academicism, or the Platonist philosophy. When I say academic, I mean that's referring to Plato's Academy. So academic, the word academic does not mean what it means today. It has a special meaning. It's a special philosophical term, and it refers essentially to the Platonic Academy. So be mindful of that. So that's really what the meaning of the title On Moral Ends, or On Ends, means. That's really what that's all about. Now, when Cicero was writing this treatise, we have to understand that Latin speakers or his fellow Romans were not really exposed, had not really been exposed in detail or in depth to the complex nuances of Greek philosophy. Okay, the Romans came late to the philosophical game. And Cicero, as a youth, had studied in Athens, he had studied in Rhodes. He was a lifelong enthusiast of philosophy. And he wanted, when he was writing his books between roughly 44 and 46 BC, 46 to 44 BC, he was trying to leave a legacy where he would expose his countrymen to the pleasures of Greek philosophy. That's really what he was trying to do. His books were written for the masses. It's kind of ironic that now his books are seen as, in some ways, a specialty type of activity, but they were really intended for a mass audience. They were intended for the multitude. And that really was his greatest legacy in many ways. And I think one of the most precious things that On Moral Ends really does is that Cicero, and I talk about this in the book in detail, is that he was able to reshape the Latin language in a way that allowed it to accommodate all these complex philosophical terms that previously had only existed in Greek. And Cicero, as we see in the beginning of Book 1, took a very, very radical line. Whereas everybody before him, in many ways, genuflected to the altar of Greek philosophical mastery, Cicero, being the plucky nationalist, I guess, that he was, took a contrarian view. He said, no, there's nothing deficient in the Latin language. There's nothing wrong with our language. Our language not only is just as good as Greek in conveying philosophical concepts, but we're actually better than the Greeks are. That Latin is actually superior to Greek. Now, to us, removed, more than 2,000 years from this controversy, this doesn't seem like a big deal. But in his day, it was a revolutionary step. It really was a very, very bold, iconoclastic step. Because what he really was asserting was the Latin-speaking world's intellectual independence from Greece. He was, in one stroke, trying to free the Latin-speaking world from the fetters, from the baggage of the Greeks. And, we have to understand that in the Eastern Mediterranean, even for many centuries later, the Greek-speaking culture, the Greek-speaking world really held sway. Greek culture had tremendous prestige. But Cicero basically said, we have something to say ourselves. We can contribute something ourselves to the philosophical discourse. And I'm going to go about and coin all these new philosophical terms in Latin so that my countrymen can really understand and make their own contributions to the field. And this is a very, very important step and should never be underestimated. And I think that too many writers in this field completely neglect to really discuss this, either because they're not aware of it or they don't really understand the importance of it, but it's there. And it's a current that really runs through his philosophical works. I mean, Cicero was a scrapper. Cicero was a fighter. And he was not willing to take a seat at the in the back of the auditorium. He had to be front and center in some ways. So this was the purpose of On Moral Ends, was to discuss this question of what is the ultimate goal, what is the most aimed at state that man should aim for. All right. Well, that being the case, the next question is, how does Cicero go about organizing his treatise? How does he explore this question of what is the end of goods? What is the highest good? As we said, he's looking at this question through the prism of three different philosophical systems, and the treatise itself is essentially three different dialogues. And in the paperback version of the book, on page 38, I have a table which breaks down the three different dialogues. It breaks down the dialogue, the speakers, the topic, the date, and the location. The first dialogue comprises books 1 and 2. There are 5 books on Moral Ends. The first dialogue is books 1 and 2, and the major speakers are Lucius Manlius Torquatus, Cicero, and a minor figure named Caius Valerius Triarius. And the topic is the Epicurean moral philosophy and criticisms of it, and the date is 50 BC, and the location is Cumae in Italy. All right. The second dialogue, again, books 3 and 4, that's where the speakers talk about Stoicism and criticisms of it. The date is 52 BC, and that's set in Tusculum. And the speakers in that dialogue are Marcus Cato and Cicero. Cicero's role is sort of like the gadfly. He kind of plays the role that Socrates did in Plato's dialogues, whom he presumably took as a guide. The third dialogue is book 5, and the Calpurnianus, Marcus Pupius Piso Calpurnianus, and he's the speaker there, and Cicero also appears in there, and there are some minor figures who I won't need to go into, his cousin and his friend Atticus, and that's where the subject of discussion is the moral philosophy of the academics, as interpreted by Antiochus of Ascalon, and the date is 79 BC, and that's in Athens, Greece. Now, let me discuss a little bit about these dialogues. It was customary in Cicero's day to put the imaginary dialogues, and this was a tradition that went back to Plato, and it was not considered inappropriate or a problem to basically use real historical figures as the mouthpieces of probably imaginary dialogues. I mean, it's very possible. I mean, these are all real people. All of the people that are involved in these dialogues were actually real historical figures. They were friends of Cicero's. And in many ways, it was a way of his honoring them, of showing them homage, and giving them, immortality in some ways by including them in his books. But whether these dialogues actually really happens, probably not. But it's likely that the speakers probably discussed similar subjects to these. I mean, these were all erudite, educated men. These were all men that were interested in philosophy, and I'm sure on more than on one occasion or more that they probably did delve into these subjects. But it's not like these are literally, there was a stenographer or something, at the back of the room taking notes down as these guys were discussing these subjects. These are educational dialogues, and they're meant to explain, discuss, and expound. So keep that in mind. And I think what we'll talk about in this first podcast is the first dialogue that takes up the first and the second books of the treatise. All right, so let's talk about books 1 and 2. And that, before we really get into that, we really should give a brief overview of Epicureanism. And there's so many subjects in this book that I really can't delve into each one with the type of detail that I would like, because that's really going to have to be your job. You have to do it. I can provide the introduction, but you're going to have to open up the book and enjoy the pleasure of actually going through this. But I think I can point the way by kind of discussing, the main points, hitting the main points, and then moving on. Epicureanism is the subject of the first and second books of On Moral Ends. And this is probably one of the most misunderstood and maligned philosophies of the Western world. And part of the problem is so few original writings of the Epicureans have survived from the classical world. And I think that's not accidental. I think that they just weren't copied. Once Christianity became the the dominant philosophical system, if you will, of Western Europe and Eastern Europe, there was less and less interest really in preserving the legacy of the Epicureans. And you will understand why when I discuss the Epicurean philosophy. It just really ran counter to the entire Christian ethic. In many ways, it was subversive. In many ways, now it's not what people think it is today. The adjective Epicurean in modern English has come to mean something very different from the actual philosophical system of the Epicureans. All right, and there is a difference, and it's important to understand what that difference is. Epicurus himself lived from 341 BC to 270 BC, and he himself was like a monk in many ways. He lived a very ascetic and austere life, and in many ways he was a very virtuous man. He himself was his conduct was above reproach, and what we know of his philosophy today really survives in a few fragments. We have Lucretius's poem De Rerum Natura, and we have Diogenes Laertius's Lives of the Philosophers, which I would recommend anybody get if they're really interested in this subject. I'm referring to page 29 here of the paperback book where I talk about that. Epicurus's goal was essentially to free mankind from what he believed were the oppressive terrors of religion. And he believed that it was pointless to worry about the gods and to obsess about theology, because we will never really be able to get to a final adjudication of this issue. This was a philosophy that was straightforward materialist. He was a materialist. He adopted the atomist or atomistic views of Democritus and believed that there was nothing really in the world except atoms in the void. And I talk about this between pages 28 and 32 of the book. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about Epicureanism because we could spend hours on it. But essentially, again, it was his focus was on trying to find a way to liberate man from the sorrows and fears of life. And he thought that his philosophy was the best way of doing this. He thought that death ends everything, that there really is no soul that persists in us after we die, and that we should seek a sensible enjoyment of pleasures tempered by a wisdom that could check excessive desires. All right. He believed that there was nothing wrong with physical pleasures, provided they were taken in moderation. Virtue to Epicurus was a means to an end. It was not an end in itself, and this is a very important distinction between him and the other philosophers. Pain, he believed, was an evil. Wisdom is the ultimate good because it frees man from his enslavement to his desires. But he defined pleasure in a very curious way. He defined pleasure really as almost in a negative sense, a kind of a freedom from pain, or a removal of pain. And in my view, anyway, I think this is a very passive view of pleasure that I think lent itself to overemphasis of avoiding life's unpleasantness. So this is just a rough, very, very rudimentary background of Epicureanism. And if you really want to get into the detail, I discuss Epicureanism in detail in the introduction to my translation. So I suggest that you go and read that. But these were the main highlights of the philosophy of Epicurus. I mean, he himself was a sincere man. He was not a chaser of physical pleasures. But and I argue this in the commentary on books 1 and 2. But I say that Epicurus probably should have known that his emphasis on removing pain, his emphasis on avoiding pain, lent itself to abuse. It would have lent itself to abuse by people who simply are looking for excuses to avoid the sometimes necessary pain that life involves. Okay, life is not, and again, I don't want to get off on my own philosophy here, but I think we're all agreed that life is in some ways expected to be painful in some ways, and to overemphasize removing that pain opens us up to, takes us down dangerous roads. So that's one way of seeing Epicureanism. But let's move on now to the first and second books of On Moral Ends. All right, well, Cicero dedicates this work to Brutus, who we've seen feature in Cicero's works in the past. And there's nothing remarkable about that, because he admired Brutus, or had admired him for a long time as a sort of a fellow traveler, politically and philosophically. But the first book of On Moral Ends starts out with a bang. It really starts out with a bang, because at the beginning of the work, that's sections, book 1, sections 9 through 11 and 12, Cicero states his candid belief that there was nothing deficient in the Latin language, and that Latin was just as capable of expressing deep philosophical nuances as was Greek. And again, as I've said before, this was a very, very revolutionary idea for its time and needs to be seen as such. Because Cicero's influence on Latin vocabulary and grammar can never be discounted. Latin was the language of educated discourse in Western Europe for many, many centuries after Cicero, and only stopped really being so arguably in the early 18th century, 1700s, maybe even a little bit later. So this is a man who had influence for many, many hundreds of years. And I think we really have to think about that and process that and really try to wrap our minds around the significance of that. The tremendous influence that Cicero had not only on philosophy, rhetoric, but also on the church fathers. So very important stuff. And Cicero places the location of the dialogue at the beginning of Book 1 in Cumae. And that's important, because as you know, I visited each and every one of these places when I was preparing this translation. And Cumae is Cicero had villas in all of these places, except Athens. He had villas in Tusculum, he had a villa in Cumae. And when I went there, it was a very, very nice, all my trips were just fantastic, but Cumae is a very mysterious place. It's right along the ocean and looks out into the Tyrrhenian Sea. And it's the location also of an oracle, a famous oracle, the priestess of Apollo, the Sibyl. And that is the second most famous Delphic, the second most famous oracle after the Delphic oracle in Greece. And so that kind of gives it a very mysterious quality, really, in the air. And you walk around the site, you can see the Acropolis there at Cumae and see the ruins of the Temple of Apollo and the cisterns and the various different buildings, roads, and it's just, I wish you could see it for yourself. And I hope if I can inspire other people to visit some of these places, I hope I will be able to do that, because you really, really gain so much by actually putting your feet on the ground and walking in the same places where these great men walked, where these great ideas were formed that influenced so much of Western civilization and Western thought. In any case, it was very nice, and the cave of the Sibyl, there's pictures of it, there's photographs of it in the book, you can go look at those, but it was a very magical experience, very mysterious place in many ways, which takes time to really wrap your mind around. Now, Cicero's main criticisms in Book 1 of Epicurus, of the Epicurean philosophy, really is that, he dismisses the atomic views of Epicurus. He considers that all nonsense. And again, because of time and space, I don't really want to spend a lot of time on Epicurean physics, which would be its atomic views, because we're more focused in this podcast on ethics. But you can read that in Book 1. He goes into real detail about that. But Cicero is not buying it. He thinks that the atomic views are nonsense. And Cicero's major objections really to Epicurus really focus on the fact that Cicero believes that Epicurus places too much emphasis on on maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. All right, in Cicero's view, virtue in many ways was seen as if not an end in itself, was something very close to that. But the Epicureans did not really believe this. They did not really believe that virtue was an end in itself. They thought that something else was the ultimate good. So that's one major point. The other, I think, one of the high points of the first book is the topic of friendship. Torquatus, at Book 1, Section 65, takes a real detour into the topic of friendship. And this is what I call a welcome diversion from the negative flavor of Epicurus's ideas. Epicurus, in many ways, had warm and humane views of friendship and thought it was a very, very positive thing. So you can read, sections, Book 1, Section 65 through 71, for more on that subject. But it's really in the second book where Cicero opens up on Torquatus and on the Epicurean philosophy in general. I mean, he really fires it up. He really lights it up, and it's in some ways it's a devastating critique of the Epicurean philosophy. Well, in the first thing, in Book 2, Section 4, he argues that the Epicurean conception of pleasure is ill-defined and confused. Okay, pleasure to him is not just pain avoidance. There is a difference between sensory pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Okay, that's a big point that Cicero makes in the second book. What Epicurus, in Cicero's view, what Epicurus never grasped is that the, quote, lack of pain is not really pleasure, but a sort of middle ground between true pleasure and true pain. And this is discussed in Book 2, Section 16. And it's this, in Cicero's view, it's this lack of attention to definitions and to fine line distinctions is where Epicurus really stumbles and makes his mistakes. This failure to pay attention to definitions and fine line distinctions is one of the main reasons, according to Cicero, why Epicurus arrived at flawed conclusions. Epicurus mistakenly conflated pleasure with the idea of absence of pain. And these are not the same thing. These are not the same thing. The problem really is that Epicurus could never really make up his mind whether he thought absence of pain was the end of goods or whether he thought pleasure was the end of goods. All right? And these are the things that Cicero chides Epicurus for. But what I think is the most devastating and the most valid criticism of Epicureanism is a very valid point, which Cicero talks about in Book 2, sections 34 through 47, really. And this is the idea that by fixating on pleasure, regardless of what Epicurus thought pleasure meant, by constantly talking about it, by constantly discussing it, by making it an issue, you're unwittingly or unknowingly opening up the door to hedonist types and people who are going to abuse the philosophy for their own self-interested purposes. We already know that as humans that we have a predilection for pleasure. We all know that. We all know that we love physical pleasure, mental pleasure, all types of pleasures. We certainly don't need any encouragement. And the problem that Cicero really is getting at with Epicurus is that he opens the door to abuses. Remember, Cicero was a man of action. This was a guy who had been consul. This was a guy who had suppressed the Catiline conspiracy. This was a man who had litigated many cases in court. This guy was not a wilting lily. This was not just some guy reclining in his country house, sitting in a chair and speculating. This was a man of action. Cicero was a man of action, and he had little to no patience for do-nothings or people who wanted to isolate themselves and talk about pleasure in the abstract without really understanding what the implications of those discussions would be. And so, quite understandably, Cicero just really had no patience for it. In Cicero's view, Epicureanism saw the virtues as little more than appendages to be used to acquire pleasures, instead of the character-building fortresses of strength that they really are. And he discusses that in Book 2, Section 69. So essentially, Epicurus pays lip service to the idea of virtue, but in fact, he had little faith in its redemptive power. Little faith. All right? And that really is, in my view, is one of the major criticisms, and the major valid criticisms of Epicurus. Again, and Cicero just hammers on these points. He hammers on Epicurus' flawed definition of pleasure, his errors in basing a theory of the end of goods on pleasure, his timid downplaying of the importance of the masculine virtues, the unsuitability of Epicureanism for a man of affairs, and his flawed theory of friendship. And I discuss all this in the commentary section on Book 2, so you should read that. That's in the paperback. It's on pages 171 to 173. So Cicero here really opens up and really lets Epicurus have it. He really shows that he has no patience for Epicureanism. And we have to admit he has a point. Because I know there are going to be people that are going to say, and again, Cicero's views are controversial here. I'm stating his views. And I personally happen to agree with them. But it's perfectly valid for someone to advocate a different view. There are people that might say, "Hey, look, Quintus, Cicero's was wrong about this. He was a little bit too harsh on Epicurus on this point. Epicurus really didn't say this. He really meant something else." Because I've read Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. I've read the extracts, the few surviving bits of Epicurus's writings that we find in Diogenes Laertius, and they seem relatively reasonable in themselves. But the problem is this: the problem is in many ways it was a negative philosophy. It was a philosophy that defined itself on avoiding pain, on removing pain. And in itself, it may be a philosophy that's suited for the elite, for someone who has a high level of discipline, maybe someone of a monkish aspect. But it's really not a philosophy that a man of action, a man of affairs is going to be willing to adopt, because I think it places too much emphasis on avoiding pain. And life really is a lot about suffering and absorbing pain. Now, again, there are many commentators who have found fault with Cicero's analyses here. And again, we don't really know precisely what Cicero's views were. Well, we have a pretty good idea. He despised Epicureanism, but it's not clear whether the arguments he puts in his own mouth, or the mouthpiece of himself, were actually his ideas, or he was just being the gadfly to drive the conversation forward. Probably a mixture of both. But in any case, books 1 and 2 of On Moral Ends are a devastating critique of the Epicurean philosophy, and I really encourage you to study the first and second books in your own time of On Moral Ends, so that you can really have a better grasp of what Epicureanism is and what its major flaws were. Because that's really what I want you to get out of this book. What I really want you to get out of On Moral Ends is I want you to be able to think for yourself as to what you think the end of goods is. What do you think the summum bonum is? What do you think it is? And as we analyze this subject through the prism of these 3 different philosophical schools, you're going to be able to fill in the blanks in your own mind. You're going to be able to formulate your own thoughts, your own ideas, your own concept of what that end of goods is. Maybe you're going to want to combine. Maybe you're going to want to be sort of the eclectic, like Cicero was, who takes a little bit from Epicurus, a little bit from the Stoics, a little bit from the Platonists, a little bit from the Aristotelians, and combine them all. And that's fine. That's fine. Nothing wrong with that. Cicero himself was a eclectic in many ways. As a lawyer, he was very used to testing ideas, weighing them, sort of savoring them, teasing them out for all of their nuances. And that's what I want you to do. I want you to do that. And I think by studying books 1 and 2 and reading my commentary, the commentary at the end of books 1 and 2, you're going to have a very, very solid grasp of Epicurus's ethical theory, the ethical underpinnings of Epicureanism, and why it can be criticized. Again, decide for yourself if you think Cicero's criticisms are valid. Don't take his word for it. Don't take my word for it. Decide for yourself. Decide for yourself. So I think that will wrap up. I want to make these podcasts not too long because I think people tend to zone out after a certain period of time. So I will move on. The next one will cover books 3 and 4, Stoicism, and we'll see where we go from there. So look for the post for this podcast on my website. I'll put a link to the book where you can get it on Amazon. Again, you can get it in Kindle or you can get it in paperback, and you'll be better equipped to study the text. All right. That'll be all for now. I'm Quintus Curtius. Good night.